Hi, it's Dr. Johnson, and I want to talk a little bit about field trips and social studies. When I was an elementary school teacher, I loved field trips. In fact, there was one year where I made a commitment to my students that I was going to take them on a field trip once a month. That took a lot of planning and preparation, but I think it was some really great learning that happened when we were out learning in the wild, to say. Now, I would like you to grab a blank piece of paper, could be lined or unlined, because I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to have you pause the video and write down your response. Here we go. The question that I have for you is, what comes to mind when I say field trip? Pause the video at this point, write down your responses, and when you're ready to restart the video, click play again. All right. A lot of you probably came up with field trips that you took when you were in school. Maybe even field trips your school traditionally had. You know, the fourth graders always went to this place. The second graders always went to the local grocery store. You probably have a lot of those experiences and things that you did. And I find that it's almost universal that schools take field trips. Everyone seems to have been on a field trip. So how do we decide where the good places are to go? Well, we can take a look at some research. People learning about history. How do people learn about history? Well, they found out that it's mostly from books, movies, and visits to museums. And so these researchers looked at this a little bit more, and they said, well, if we wanted to make sure we were learning history accurately, which one of these places or people would we talk to about it? So think in your head really quick, of those 6 things on the screen, what's the most accurate source of information? Well, these researchers found out that museums were, in fact, the most accurate source of information, followed by personal accounts from grandparents and other relatives. But movies were the most commonly used way to learn about history. And the researchers thought about this, and they said, why do people like movies? And they found out that movies are great because people love to hear a good story. But what people don't know is that museums and other sources of field trips, other places we can take field trips, are great opportunities to tell good stories to our students. So, where do we commonly go on field trips to where we can get a good story? Well, the fact is we can go anywhere for a field trip, but the most common place that we end up going are to places like the State Capitol building, or to a historic site like the USS Missouri, or to a museum. And we go to these places because they tell stories. Just being there in a museum, there are stories in the displays all around us. There are museum staff that can help us understand and interpret history for our students. They tell stories. When we go to the Battleship Missouri, there are volunteers there who help the students understand history. And it's a story, it's an experience. It's not just an outside experience from the classroom, but it's an engaging experience because we're in a place that can be very engaging. But we can't limit ourselves just to these places. Now, let me talk really quickly about why these places are important, these kind of traditional field trip locations. These are effective because they usually have some sort of staff that are experts on the topic. And when we think about effective place for field trips, we want to be able to make sure we're giving our students correct information. So that's why we go to these places. In fact, most of these places have established educational programs where they will do the lesson and the instruction for you. And that's very appealing as a teacher. We're busy. We have lots to do. So these can be very effective places because of those 2 things. We have experts that are teaching our students, and they take the pressure off of us as teachers. But don't limit yourselves to just these traditional places. Like here is a place I took my students on a field trip. Do you know where it is? It's right outside my classroom window. We were studying about how early settlers in Utah used different plants. We're talking about how did they, what do they use to season things with? What do they use to plant outside their cabins and their other areas? And for what purposes? And so we went right outside our door where we had a native garden, and we looked at the plants. This was far more effective than reading about it in a book or looking at it on a web page. The students were able to rub their fingers in that middle picture, rub their fingers around those little yellow flowers, and smell it release a scent that was almost like an air, a carpet freshener. And they learned that the pioneers would dry these plants, and then when the ladies would sweep out of the dugout or the cabin, they would actually take the dried ones and crumple them up on the floor, and as they swept, it would cause this nice aroma to be created. So think places that you could go locally. I mean, this was right outside my classroom. If I was at Laie Elementary School, there are so many historical markers around Laie where we could teach the students about local history. These are just 3 of the historical markers around Laie within a walking distance of the elementary school. There are many, many more. So this would be a great place to go because it makes a connection for the students to a local community and probably to their local lives. So that's another thing to remember. Field trips are great to make connections. So a great place to go on a field trip is anywhere you can make a connection. Now, even if we don't have connections to get in places like the Opana radar site, which is under military supervision, we could still use this local area, which is, by the way, just by Cavella Bay. It's up on the hillside. We could connect our primary source documents. And I think we looked at this primary source document earlier in the semester. This is the radar map of the 2 gentlemen on 7th of December 1941 who were the first ones to have a radar blip of the Japanese planes coming in to bomb Pearl Harbor. So good field trip sites are places where we can make connections. And even if we couldn't visit the actual Opana radar site, we could visit it virtually through video, through photos, through Google Maps, and then make connections to our local learning. Now, local. Here's another reason why local is really good, because there are hidden gems locally. Take a look at this facade. Do you notice some of those things on there? If I lived in Louisville, Kentucky, there is so many great stuff here that I could walk down and visit the city hall to teach my students a little bit about local history and how progress and development of the local community happened. Think about all those hidden gems you might have in your local community. In fact, right now, what I would like you to do is take that piece of paper that you have and pause the video and write down where are all the local places, all the places that you could walk to right now from wherever you're sitting at. Where are places that might be little gems, little hidden gems, where you could teach and make connections to social studies? When you have your list finished, then go ahead and restart the video. All right, do you have a great list of local places? Now, local places are great because usually they're easier to get to. Usually we don't have all of the preparation that we have for other things in a field trip. If I'm taking a local field trip, I have to make sure that I have all my students. I probably am going to take a first aid kit, probably going to ask students to use the restroom before we go, and I might have to get permission to leave the school campus, but I've also been in schools where I don't have to have permission. Now, once we go beyond the local, then we get into a lot more things that a teacher needs to plan and prepare for a field trip. So, once again, I'd like you to pause the video at this point and write down what are all the things that a teacher might need to plan and prepare for a field trip. When you have your list ready, then go ahead and restart the video. All right, I don't know what's on your list, but my list is like 1.5 miles long. On my list, I have everything from field trip permission forms, medical forms, take a first aid kit. I have to plan transportation, and transportation on itself is crazy. For instance, can we walk there? Can we take local transportation? Can we take the bus or the train? Could we have parents drive and students ride with parents? If we do parents have to have special permission? Do they have to have a background check? Or if I'm going to take a school-approved transportation, a school bus, what do I need to figure out with that? How do I need to arrange it, schedule it? And probably most importantly for a teacher, how is that going to get paid for? That's just transportation. And you probably have tons of other things on your list, like what to bring, what to wear. Are you going to have students bring a clipboard and a pencil to take notes? Are they going to have to wear name tags or not name tags? What time do they have to be at the school? What time are you going to leave by? And if you say you're going to leave at 8 o'clock in the morning, what happens if you have 5 kids that aren't there at 8? Do you leave? Or do you wait around for 10 more minutes? There are so many things in planning a field trip that it can be overwhelming, and it's a reason maybe some teachers don't do field trips. Don't let it overwhelm you, because there are some ways and some things that you can do to help yourself out. Now, let me show you some field trips that I took. This is a field trip to a local orchard. You can see me over here on the left. In fact, you can see Dr. Latham over here. This field trip we took actually just down the hill from Dr. Latham's house. I was teaching with her husband, Mark Wallen, and these are our 4th graders. And we knew that there was a local egg farm. And we called the egg farm up and said, we'd love to come visit. And they're like, well, we usually don't have schools, but we would love to show you around. So we went and learned about production. We learned about the economics of eggs. We learned how they produce eggs, how they wash eggs, how they grade and sort eggs. And we learned all about the egg production business. And then we went over to this orchard just down the hill. And it was Dr. Latham's neighbor. And we picked apples, and we made caramel apples, and we made apple cider, and we did all sorts of things about harvest and agriculture, which are all social studies topics. And we had a great time. We spent the entire day out there learning about agriculture, economics, and things that made a great connection to our students because they lived in this area. This was part of their community. Other places that you might go. Here's a historical farm that I took my students to. This farm is perpetually stuck in the year 1917. This was great because they did educational tours. This is an educational docent talking to my students about the farm. But another great thing about this farm is not only did they teach students about the history of 1917, but I said to them, hey, what if my students were to come and volunteer? We spent an hour and a half, 2 hours in the morning doing whatever you need. Picking up trash, cleaning out the goalie, setting up the pumpkins for the Halloween event, picking corn. We did all sorts of stuff. And in exchange for those 2 hours, you let me spend 2 hours teaching the students on site. And they were very agreeable to that. So we would go there and we did all sorts of great things. And in return, I then had my students for 2 hours at a place-based area where we could talk and teach them history about how Utah settlers lived, but we were able to do it on a site that was very relatable to them. So think about all of these places and also think outside the box. They may offer educational programs which are great, take advantage of them, but think about how you can make connections to your students. Because remember, a great field trip location is any place where you can make a connection to what you need your students to be able to know or be able to do. All right, let's look at some other examples. I got thinking about field trips on Oahu. You know, I moved to Oahu in 2014, and I thought, where could I go on a field trip to? And I started finding all sorts of great places that I could do social studies field trips. Some of these are very formal, like the Bishop Museum down here in Honolulu. It's a museum. There is the Hawaiian Plantation Village in Waipahu. They both do educational programs, which are great. But there are other places you might not have known about, like the Hawaiian Railway. Or Shangri-La, which has a museum of Islamic art. There are the fish ponds around the island. And I just came up with just so many places that not only related to historical connections that I could make with my students, but most of these places have educational programs and they want students to come and attend. So when you start thinking about where could I go in my local area, where could I go within 20 miles of me? Grab your Google Maps and start off with museums. You know, where are museums around me? And look at what museums might be good. But then start looking at other places that have some sort of social studies connection that might be good places for you to take students. Google Maps for me is the best thing because it provides that information easily. And for those of you that don't know, you can actually, with your Google account, create a customized map, which is what I've done here. Now, it's your turn because you have an assignment to plan out a field trip. When you plan out your field trip, the description is in Canvas, but think big. Do what Walt Disney says. Think of the impossible. It's kind of fun to do the impossible. Don't limit yourself to just the standard, museum trip. Look at some fun places that you might go where you think students would really get connected to the curriculum, but that they would also enjoy learning in place. Now, field trips are great. I think you'll love them. Remember the key things, that a field trip can be taken to any place where you can make a connection and allow students to be able to know or be able to do what you need, and also places where you can keep students safe and get them engaged in active content. Thanks so much.